Dive into the enigmatic world of ancient Egypt, a civilization shrouded in mystery and allure. This exploration delves into 15 aberrant sexual practices that challenge modern perceptions. From the divine bloodlines maintained through incestuous pharaonic marriages to the raw depictions of the Turin erotic papyrus, these practices offer a glimpse into a society where sexuality intertwined seamlessly with mythology, power, and daily life.
What makes you happy?
Brace yourself for a journey through the lesser-known, sometimes startling aspects of Egyptian intimacy. Number 1. Incestuous marriages among pharaohs. In ancient Egypt, the concept of incest, particularly among the pharaohs, was not merely accepted, but often encouraged as a divine mandate. The pharaohs, revered as gods in their own right, frequently married within their family, including siblings and even daughters, a practice deeply rooted in their theology and the preservation of the royal bloodline. This custom, perplexing and taboo by today's standards, was a strategic move to maintain the purity of what was believed to be a divine lineage, distinct and elevated above the common populace. The rationale behind such marriages was multifaceted. Firstly, it was about the consolidation of power. By marrying within the family, the pharaoh ensured that the royal authority and wealth remained intact and unchallenged by external influences. This practice was also seen as a reflection of the divine order. Many Egyptian gods and goddesses were paired with their siblings, with stories of Isis and Osiris being the most prominent. Thus, the pharaoh emulating the gods was a way to reaffirm his divine status. Moreover, the incestuous unions among the pharaohs were a political tool. These marriages often strengthened alliances within the family, reducing the likelihood of internal power struggles. It was also a demonstration of the pharaoh's power, showing that he was above the conventional moral codes that governed the lives of ordinary Egyptians. However, these incestuous unions were not without consequences. Genetic problems likely arose from such close familial unions, potentially leading to health complications and genetic deformities, as seen in the case of Tutankhamun. The young pharaoh, famous for his untimely death, is speculated to have suffered from various health issues due to the incestuous nature of his parentage. This practice of incestuous marriages among the pharaohs presents a stark contrast to the societal norms of ancient Egypt's commoners, where such unions were not standard. It underscores the chasm between the divine rulers and their subjects, emphasizing the extraordinary lives led by the pharaohs, governed by beliefs and customs far removed from those of their people. As we delve deeper into the sexual practices of ancient Egyptians, it becomes evident that their views on intimacy, relationships, and marriage were complex and deeply influenced by their religious and cultural ideologies. Number 2. Erotic encounters among priests and court members. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was not confined to the private sphere, but permeated through various layers of society, including the sacred realms of temples and the opulent courts of pharaohs. One of the most startling revelations of this aspect comes from the Turin erotic papyrus, a remarkable document that depicts a series of explicit sexual scenes involving court members and, perhaps, priests. This papyrus, dating back to the New Kingdom period, showcases an array of sexual acts, unbridled in their depiction and bold in nature. The illustrations feature men and women, possibly members of the elite class, engaged in diverse sexual activities. What makes this artifact particularly intriguing is the inclusion of humorous and sometimes crude captions accompanying the images, suggesting a culture where sex was not only an act of intimacy but also one of joy and playfulness. The involvement of priests in such depictions, although still debated among historians, suggests a complex relationship between sexuality and religion in ancient Egypt. Unlike many contemporary civilizations, Egyptian priests were not expected to practice celibacy. In fact, sexual potency was often associated with religious and spiritual strength. This intertwining of the carnal and the spiritual indicates a society where the sacred and the profane were not always distinctly separated. Number 3. Early age marriages, independence and tradition. Marriage in ancient Egypt, particularly among commoners, was a blend of tradition and practicality, with a notable feature being the relatively young age at which people married. Typically, Egyptian women were wedded around the age of 14, while men entered marriage slightly later, around 16. These early marriages, however, did not necessarily signify a lack of agency or independence, especially for women. In contrast to many ancient societies, Egyptian women enjoyed considerable autonomy. They had rights to own, manage, and inherit property, and their status in marriage was relatively egalitarian. The marriage itself was a social agreement rather than a religious or legal one, often without formal ceremonies. Couples would simply start living together, marking the beginning of their conjugal life. The reasons behind early marriages were multifaceted. Primarily, it was a response to the practicalities of life in ancient Egypt. With a life expectancy much lower than what we experience today, starting a family at a young age was necessary for the continuation of lineage and for support in old age. Furthermore, given the importance placed on fertility and progeny in Egyptian culture, marrying early increased the chances of having more children. These marriages, though formed at a young age, were not necessarily oppressive for women. In fact, women had significant rights within the marriage. They could own and manage their dowries independently, and in cases of divorce, which women could initiate, they retained rights to their property. This degree of independence is notable, especially when compared to contemporaneous civilizations. Number 4. Polygamy among the elite. In the stratified society of ancient Egypt, polygamy was a practice largely confined to the pharaohs and the elite. While monogamy was the norm among the general populace, the upper echelons of society, especially the pharaohs, often had multiple wives. This practice was not just a matter of personal choice or desire, but was deeply intertwined with the political, social, and religious fabric of the time. For a pharaoh, having several wives was part of the royal duty. Each marriage served a specific purpose. Some were for consolidating power and forging alliances with powerful families or foreign nations, while others were for ensuring a sufficient number of heirs. The great royal wife, usually of royal blood herself, held a prestigious position, and her primary role was to produce a male heir to secure the royal lineage. The other wives and concubines of the pharaoh, often from foreign lands or lower ranks of nobility, played roles in strengthening political alliances and maintaining harmony within the empire. These marriages were strategic, ensuring loyalty from different regions and factions within the kingdom. Number 5. Religious sex practices, a sacred union. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was not just a personal affair, but was deeply embedded in the religious and spiritual fabric of the society. Certain religious practices and rituals involved sexual acts, reflecting the Egyptians' belief in the sacredness of sexuality. Fertility rites were particularly significant in this context. These rituals were not merely symbolic, but often involved actual sexual acts. They were conducted to ensure the fertility of the land and the people, an essential concern in a society heavily reliant on agriculture. The rituals often mimicked the mythical sexual encounters of the gods, symbolizing creation and regeneration. In some temple rituals, the union of the god and the goddess, often enacted by the pharaoh and the high priestess, was considered crucial for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance. This ritualistic intercourse was seen as a sacred duty, an offering to the gods to ensure the prosperity and stability of the kingdom. Additionally, there were festivals like the Feast of the Valley, where it is believed that sexual activities played a part in the celebrations. These festivals, combining religious observance with communal joy, might have included ceremonial sexual acts as a form of worship and communion with the divine. Sexuality in the religious context was also evident in the numerous fertility amulets and talismans that depicted sexual imagery. These were used not just for personal protection or luck, but often in religious ceremonies to invoke the gods' blessings for fertility and protection. Number 6. Prostitution and oral sex in ancient society. In the societal tapestry of ancient Egypt, prostitution occupied a distinctive and surprisingly open role. Unlike many contemporary cultures, where prostitution was viewed with disdain, the ancient Egyptians had a more pragmatic and less moralistic approach to it. This perspective extended to practices like oral sex, which, in Egyptian society, was not shrouded in the taboos prevalent in other ancient civilizations. Prostitution in Egypt was not institutionalized in the sense of brothels, but was more a part of the social fabric, with some women and men offering sexual services for economic benefits. These sex workers were not outcasts, but rather integrated into society, their services accepted as a part of life. In fact, some references suggest that prostitutes specialized in oral sex, a practice that was depicted in some Egyptian artworks, indicating its prevalence and acceptance. The Egyptian attitude towards oral sex, especially in the context of prostitution, stands in stark contrast to that of other ancient cultures like the Romans, where it was viewed with contempt. In Egypt, sex, in its various forms, was seen more as a natural, enjoyable part of human existence, devoid of the heavy moral overtones found elsewhere. Number 7. The sacred value of semen in Egyptian mythology. In the rich tapestry of ancient Egyptian mythology, semen held a place of profound sacred significance, intertwined with creation, life, and the divine. One of the most striking examples of this reverence is found in the myth of Atum, the creator god in the Heliopolitan creation myth. According to the myth, Atum created the universe through an act of masturbation, with his semen giving birth to the first divine couple, Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture. This story of creation through a solitary sexual act places semen as a potent life-giving force, a symbol of divine creative power. It underscores the Egyptians' view of sexual fluids not just as a means of procreation, but as carriers of life essence and sacred power. In a society that placed great emphasis on fertility and the continuity of life, semen was revered not merely as a biological substance, but as a crucial element in the cosmic cycle of creation and regeneration. The sacred value of semen is also reflected in the numerous fertility amulets and talismans that were common in ancient Egypt. These often depicted symbols of virility and procreation, underscoring the importance of sexual potency and the life-generating powers of semen. Moreover, the link between semen and divinity is evident in the rituals and iconography associated with the pharaohs. The pharaohs, considered divine beings themselves, were often associated with fertility and creation myths. The royal rituals at times included references to the creative powers of semen, symbolizing the pharaoh's role as a sustainer of life and order in the kingdom. Number 8. Necrophilia, a shadowed aspect of Egyptian culture. Necrophilia, a subject that evokes discomfort and taboo in most modern societies, finds a shadowed reference in ancient Egyptian culture, particularly within the domain of funerary practices. The Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical document, provides a fleeting glimpse into this obscure aspect, suggesting that necrophilia might have been practiced by some embalmers, though it was not a socially accepted norm. The practice of embalming in ancient Egypt was deeply sacred, intended to preserve the body for the afterlife. However, there are indications that some embalmers might have engaged in sexual acts with the deceased during the mummification process. This disturbing aspect is mentioned in passing in some ancient texts, though the extent and acceptance of such practices remain largely speculative and shrouded in mystery. The concept of necrophilia in ancient Egypt must be viewed through the lens of their beliefs about death and the afterlife. Death was not seen as an end, but a transition to another realm. The preservation of the body was crucial for the deceased's journey into the afterlife. In this context, the act of necrophilia, though not mainstream, might have been intertwined with beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the preservation of the body. It is important to note that these instances of necrophilia were not reflective of the broader societal norms, but rather aberrations, likely frowned upon by the majority of the population. The practice would have been at odds with the Egyptian reverence for the dead and the meticulous care with which they treated their deceased. Number 9. Bestiality in ancient Egyptian imagery. The presence of bestiality in ancient Egyptian art and imagery points to a society where the boundaries between the human and animal worlds were fluid and often symbolically intertwined, while direct. Evidence of the practice of bestiality is scarce, and its actual prevalence in society is debated. Its depiction in some artworks suggests a cultural awareness of such practices. Ancient Egyptian art often depicted animals with great reverence, portraying them as deities or as symbolic representations of gods. This close association with animals in their mythology and religion might have led to some overlap in the sexual sphere, as seen in certain artworks. These images, however, should not be taken as direct evidence of widespread bestiality in everyday life, but rather as symbolic or ritualistic representations, possibly reflecting mythological narratives rather than actual practices. The imagery of humans and animals engaged in sexual acts, found in some tomb paintings and artifacts, might have served symbolic purposes, representing fertility, creation myths, or the union of the earthly and the divine. The Egyptians believed in the power of images and symbols to convey deep religious and cultural meanings, and these depictions might have been part of this symbolic language. Moreover, the portrayal of bestiality in art could also be interpreted within the context of the Egyptians. Complex and often metaphorical understanding of sexuality. It is possible that these images were not meant to be taken literally, but were instead artistic expressions of the interconnectedness of all life forms, a concept deeply ingrained in their worldview. Number 10. Contraception and family planning. Innovations of ancient times. In the realm of family planning and contraception, ancient Egypt stands out as a pioneer, employing innovative methods that reflect a sophisticated understanding of reproductive health. Their approach to contraception was not only practical, but also remarkably advanced for its time, incorporating both natural ingredients and a deep grasp of the female reproductive system. One of the most notable methods used by the Egyptians was a concoction of dates, acacia, and honey, which was applied intravaginally. Acacia, in particular, is known to have spermicidal properties, a fact that demonstrates the Egyptians' keen observational skills and understanding of herbal medicine. Additionally, they utilized vaginal pessaries made from various substances, including crocodile dung. While this may sound unappealing to modern sensibilities, crocodile dung is alkaline, potentially creating an environment hostile to sperm. These methods were not mere superstitions, but had practical, effective elements, highlighting the Egyptians' advanced knowledge in the field of gynecology and medicine. The use of such contraceptives indicates a society where women's reproductive health was acknowledged and addressed, and where family planning was an integral part of life. Moreover, the ancient Egyptians' approach to contraception reflects a broader cultural acceptance of sexual activity as a natural part of life, unburdened by the guilt and taboo associated with it in many other ancient societies. The ability to control pregnancy was a significant aspect of women's health and autonomy, allowing them to manage their fertility according to their needs and circumstances. Number 11. Fertility rituals and magic, seeking blessings. Fertility, both in terms of human reproduction and agricultural abundance, was a central concern in ancient Egyptian society. To this end, a variety of fertility rituals and magical practices were employed, reflecting the Egyptians' belief in the supernatural's power to influence the natural world. These rituals were an intricate blend of religion, magic, and medicine, aimed at invoking divine favor and ensuring the continuation of life. The fertility rituals often involved symbolic or actual sexual acts, mirroring the union of gods and goddesses in Egyptian mythology. These acts were not merely for human procreation, but were also believed to stimulate the fertility of the land, essential in a civilization heavily reliant on agriculture. Rituals could involve processions, offerings, and the enactment of mythological scenes, all intended to invoke the gods' blessings for abundant crops and numerous offspring. Magic played a crucial role in these rituals. Amulets, spells, and incantations were commonly used, believed to harness supernatural powers to promote fertility. Fertility amulets, often depicting symbols of fecundity and procreation, were worn by women desiring to conceive. Similarly, spells and incantations were recited, calling upon the gods to bless the land and its people with fertility. In addition to these practices, the Egyptians also held festivals and celebrations centered around fertility. One such festival was the Feast of Min, the god of fertility and reproduction. During this festival, phallic symbols were paraded, and lettuce, believed to be an aphrodisiac, was consumed in large quantities. These celebrations were not just religious observances, but also community gatherings, reinforcing the communal aspect of fertility and the collective desire for life's continuation. The fertility rituals and magic of ancient Egypt demonstrate a society deeply connected to the cycles of nature and the divine. These practices, steeped in religious and magical beliefs, underscore the Egyptians' reverence for life and their proactive efforts to ensure its perpetuation through both human and agricultural fertility. Number 12. Sexual imagery in art and hieroglyphs, a bold expression. In ancient Egypt, sexual imagery was a prevalent and bold expression in art and hieroglyphs, reflecting a society where sexuality was an acknowledged and integral aspect of life. These depictions were far from mere erotic representations. They were imbued with symbolic meanings and were an essential part of the religious and cultural fabric. Sexual imagery in Egyptian art was not confined to private spaces but was often displayed publicly, indicating a societal acceptance of sexuality as a natural part of human existence. Hieroglyphs, the written language of the Egyptians, included symbols that were explicitly sexual. These symbols, however, were not used solely for their erotic connotations, but also for their phonetic value and symbolic meanings related to themes like fertility, creation, and rebirth. This imagery was present in a variety of mediums, from temple walls to tomb paintings, papyri, and sculptures. They depicted a range of sexual activities and often included fertility gods and goddesses. In some instances, the pharaohs themselves were depicted in sexually explicit scenes, underscoring their association with fertility and divine power. Moreover, sexual imagery in Egyptian art was not exclusively heterosexual. There are instances of homosexual acts being depicted, though these are less frequent and often subject to debate among historians. Regardless, these depictions contribute to our understanding of the complexity and diversity of sexual expression in ancient Egyptian society. Sexual imagery in Egyptian art and hieroglyphs was thus a multifaceted expression, intertwining the erotic with the sacred and the symbolic. It reflects a society that viewed sexuality as a powerful force, integral to their understanding of the world and their place in it. Number 13. Sexual education in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egyptian society, the topic of sexual education, though not explicitly documented, was likely an integral part of the cultural and social upbringing. Given the Egyptians' open attitudes towards sexuality, as evidenced in their art and literature, it is plausible that young people received some form of education on sexual matters. This education likely encompassed the physical aspects of sex, marriage expectations, and family responsibilities. It is believed that much of this knowledge was imparted within the family unit, passed down from parents to children in a manner that was frank but respectful of the cultural norms and values. In addition to familial instruction, those training in temples or as scribes might have received more formalized education, including aspects of sexual conduct, religious teachings on sexuality, and even contraceptive methods. The role of sexuality in Egyptian mythology and religion also suggests that sexual knowledge was not taboo, but an accepted and necessary part of life. The prominence of fertility gods and goddesses, the explicit nature of some religious rituals, and the use of sexual symbols and amulets would have necessitated some level of understanding and education about sexual matters. Additionally, considering the Egyptians' advanced medical knowledge, as evidenced by their practices in contraception and gynecology, it is likely that sexual health was a part of this medical understanding and was possibly included in the broader scope of sexual education. Number 14. Homosexuality and same-sex relationships, a contemplative look. The topic of homosexuality and same-sex relationships in ancient Egypt is one of nuanced interpretation and scholarly debate. While explicit evidence is less forthcoming compared to other aspects of Egyptian sexuality, there are intriguing hints in historical records and art that suggest the existence of such relationships. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence is the tomb of Khnum-Hotep and Niankhkhnum, high-ranking officials who lived during the 5th dynasty. The tomb's artwork depicts these two men in intimate poses, often reserved for married couples, including scenes where their noses are touching, a traditional Egyptian representation of a kiss. Some scholars interpret this as indicative of a same-sex relationship, while others caution against reading modern understandings of sexuality into ancient contexts. Beyond this, references to homosexuality in ancient Egyptian texts are sparse and often ambiguous. The silence in the historical record could be due to various reasons, including the possibility that homosexuality was not a defined concept as understood today, or that it was simply not a significant concern in Egyptian society to merit extensive documentation. What can be gleaned from the available evidence is that the ancient Egyptians may have had a different understanding and social structuring of sexuality than contemporary societies. Relationships and sexual practices that deviated from the norm might have been viewed through a different lens, one not necessarily defined by modern categories of sexual orientation. Number 15. Divorce and women's rights in relationships. In ancient Egyptian society, women held a unique position in terms of their rights and autonomy, particularly in the context of marriage and divorce. Unlike many other ancient civilizations, Egyptian women enjoyed significant legal and social rights, which extended to their roles within marital relationships. Marriages in ancient Egypt were primarily civil arrangements, and women had the right to initiate divorce. The reasons for divorce varied, but could include infertility, infidelity, or incompatibility. Following a divorce, women were entitled to a fair share of the marital property, often receiving back their dowry and a portion of the shared assets. This level of financial security post-divorce was remarkable for the time and speaks to the relatively high status of women in Egyptian society. Furthermore, women in ancient Egypt could own, manage, and dispose of property independently, including land, servants, and material possessions. They could enter into contracts, sue and be sued, and even represent themselves in court, rights that were not commonly available to women in other ancient societies. These rights also extended into their married lives. Women were not seen as mere appendages to their husbands, but as active partners. They could manage their own finances and property, and were often seen working alongside men in various professions.